Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we have arrived at the Month of Ramuh, or Ramuh if you're in Final Fantasy 15 for whatever reason. This month will be heavily focused on the Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles series, but before we dive into those, I wanted to take a look at the jobs in the job system, which is actually a really defining feature of the franchise. It even shows up in games when they don't have an explicit, overt job system to speak of. This will be a multi-part episode that I'll return to soon, but for now, let's just get the basics out of the way. As I said before, the job system is one of the foundations of the franchise. In fact, it's the first interaction that you have with Final Fantasy I. What's interesting about the job system is how it reflects many of the other systems that tabletop games use. An easy example would be Dungeons & Dragons with their class system. So, Square decided not to simply copy the generic classes that we have in tabletop games that most players are familiar with, like the cleric, wizard, or druid. That is not to say that some aren't used, because most of the differentiation comes in the form of magic users. Specifically in Final Fantasy, they're different colored mages. You have your red mage, white mage, etc. I've talked about this in Final Fantasy I video that ended in the month of Shiva, and we'll go over it again in the next portion of these jobs videos. So what exactly is a job? Well, it's just basically a particular feature that defines a character and what you can do. In Final Fantasy, it's mostly oriented to battles, but in regular tabletop games, a job or a class is something that you'll do outside and inside of battle. The interesting thing about these jobs is that they often come through some sort of crystal or orb, which is a huge part of Final Fantasy, obviously. Think something like Power Rangers, that you get something, like I said, a crystal or an orb, which will allow you to have these special powers. Anyway, in these games where you can select your job, there usually exists a system that'll let you get to these more complex or higher tier jobs. For example, if you want to activate these prestige jobs, then you have to level up 2 different jobs to attain that new one. This is especially relevant in games like Final Fantasy Tactics. For example, maybe to become a Dark Knight, you would have to level up a warrior and then a black mage, and then you would get access to that class, because it's kind of a hybrid of the two. But these hybrid jobs aren't necessarily the same across all systems, so it really just depends on the particular game that you're going to get into. So I just briefly want to go over what is basically the holy, I don't know, sextet, if you want to call it that, of jobs. There are 6 basic jobs, and these jobs are the foundation of the franchise. They appear in Final Fantasy I and pretty much throughout the rest of the series. They are the Fighter, also called Warrior, the Black Belt, which is also called Monk, the Thief, the Black Mage, the White Mage, and finally the Red Mage. I had intended to go over all 6 of these, but as I started making this particular script, it became way too long. So this is going to be divided up into 2 different videos. Right now, we're just going to focus on the martial classes, and then in the next one, we'll focus on the magical-based classes. So, a fighter or a warrior, as it's sometimes called, in fact usually called a warrior, is just about the most basic job you can get. You hit things and you hit them hard. That's literally all there is to it. Now, that being said, since then, warriors have been bestowed more abilities by the creators of the games with suitable specific actions that more properly give him a wider scope than just hit stuff. Most of these main protagonists in the series would be considered a warrior, though not all of them. A little bit of extra information that you may not have known, and I certainly didn't know until I started researching this, was that the warrior is actually the canon character of Final Fantasy I. He is the warrior of light that you speak of. You'll see him appear in games like Final Fantasy Dissidia and the Theater Rhythm game that we talked about. The fighter from Final Fantasy I is the main character in that game. As far as the actions and how they are treated in combat, the monk and the thief are generally the same. Now, they again have been given different actions, and the thief is usually going to be able to steal items from the enemies. The monk has some magical abilities sometimes, not always, but those other 2 jobs just round out these 3 major martial classes. As I said before, that most of the main protagonists are the warriors, but a few aren't. Specifically, Final Fantasy IV, Cecil was a Dark Knight, and in Final Fantasy IX, Zidane was a thief. So those are some examples that are of characters that are the main characters that are not exactly exactly just regular warriors. So since the warriors usually get all of the limelight for being the central characters in these games, let's go over some other main characters, or at least protagonists, that are the thieves and monks. So right now we'll talk about thieves, and the most notable thieves include Final Fantasy VI's Locke. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, Locke. That's a treasure hunter, right? Not thief. They kind of have a hard feeling about that. Anyway, Final Fantasy VII's Yuffie is clearly a thief. She's also a ninja. You can make that argument as well. Many games have this overlapping thief ninja, maybe assassin quality about them. Some actually divide them up into separate classes, some don't. But clearly Yuffie is a thief because she steals your stuff. If you just looked at her, you would think that she would be a ninja, but trust me, she's a thief. Anyway, another notable thief is Final Fantasy X's Riku. So she's a thief as well, and Final Fantasy IX, the main character, obviously Zidane, is a thief that I already mentioned. What's kind of funny to me is that in tabletop games, they've largely moved away from that thief archetype. They've called them rogues, and Final Fantasy, they haven't done that at all. I mean, they are pretty much always thief. So I know some games do call them rogues, but pretty much you're going to see thieves in Final Fantasy, which is, I don't know, it's kind of cool that they held their ground and made that thief aspect part of the franchise, just on a very basic level. So we'll round this off with the popular monks of the franchise. We have Final Fantasy IV's Yang. He's probably the first named character that is a monk, and he's introduced. He's very cool. Final Fantasy VI's Sabin has monk qualities as well. Very, very cool character that's introduced to the game. I really enjoy Sabin. Final Fantasy VII's Tifa is obviously based off of the monk. Anyone that punches, you can just probably qualify as a monk. So Tifa, definitely a monk, even though Final Fantasy VII doesn't have a proper job system. Final Fantasy VIII, obviously Zell is a monk. Final Fantasy IX's monk is Amarant, who actually kind of looks like a fighter, but he is the monk. And it's good to note that the monk is also sometimes called the pugilist. I don't know how to say that, but you'll see that as well. And in Final Fantasy I, he is called the Black Belt. So monk, pugilist, black belt, all of that together, that they're just talking about the same thing, basically. Wait, through the magic of editing, the internet tells me that it is pugilist. So if you ever wondered about that, there you go. Pugilist. So I'm going to close out the video now. In the coming months, or perhaps even sooner, we'll revisit this topic and look at the magic users from the 6 basic jobs, the White Mage, Black Mage, and my personal favorite, spoiler, Red Mage. Next time during the month of Ramuh, we will look at Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles and its implication of the release. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.